common is linked to, sure, social, economic changes, but also technological changes, right? Changes in communication and information technology. So, to put the question very bluntly, do you recognize your notion of the common in this both specific and rather general idea of the field that Molly has presented to us just now?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so, but I'm not sure really that it doesn't necessarily make the link to the political for me.
Well,
I can't see it.
Well, there's a sub-question here, or subtext here, of course, because it is a pre-industrial space.
Quite deliberately so.
Yeah. Which would seem to fly in the face of what you argue is where the common would develop.
Or, I mean, of course it develops there too, about struggles over land. One can think about struggles over land elsewhere too, landless workers in Brazil, throughout Latin America, etc. But it seems more closely related to artistic practice to me when one thinks about the common not as something given like land, but rather something constructed like our visual field.
Well, then you have to ask the question about, what is a work? Because work is not necessarily a picture anymore. And, the way in which, one makes a work in relation to an economy, let's say, and which could have one kind of market or another kind of market. The sort of luxury art market is not necessarily the determinant market for many people. But we may not know too much about them because they're not interested in sort of rising to the level of fame, that would get them noticed at a certain strata of consistency, right? But we implicit in a lot of the, sort of attention-getting is this sense that we're going to find geniuses, and we're going to find fame for them, and we're going to, take our culture forward in time, on the backs of artists. And, that part of it doesn't get talked about too much because it's very vulgar. Think that way.
I heard you say the commons is an area where it's not privatized and it's taken away from public control. So, what is it? I mean, who controls? There is always control in a society. There is always exercise of single sphere. There is always exercise of political control. I mean, so I very often think that those who say, well, now we are going to create this area, the commons, which is within the private and the public, they have a hidden agenda. They have a hidden agenda. They don't want to tell us who is going to control it.
So the question is there anything possible other than private control through private property or public control through state regulations? And you say no. Now, the question isn't just about organization. I mean, the question is it possible? And I think this the other day is where I think Chantal and I, made precise a difference in our way of thinking about these things, which doesn't stand at the level of institutions or organization. Because I also would agree that there has to be a form of organization, there has to be a form of institutionalization. But I would think that I thought that it seemed clear to us that at least one of the differences resides at the level of, is it possible that there be a self-organization of institutions in a relationship of equality? Now that's what I'm proposing. So I'm not proposing, I mean, what seemed to me your caricature of it was a lot like, I mean, the better example would be this Joe Freeman essay that circulated a lot in feminist movements in the 70s in the US called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, in which the claim was that in feminist groups that were claiming democracy, wanting to institute a kind of democracy organization within the feminist group, that was really just hiding the fact that certain people, because they spoke better, because they were more charismatic, actually enacted some sort of tyranny. So I'm perfectly conscious of that, what should we call that, the tyranny of structurelessness. But rather, I do have the assumption, and that's why, and I would point to examples to try to think of its plausibility, but at least I would like to establish its desirability. that in my terms, democracy is possible. It's not what, I know that's not what Chantal would call democracy, but that doesn't matter. What I mean is that, well, we can disagree about the name of the terms, but what I mean is that a equal and free self-organization of social structures is possible. And that seems to me something that is outside of...
that's liberal society.
Not the way I learned it and lived it, but if you think that's what it is, well...
My point is that if we are thinking in terms of politics, we should think in terms of the public. There are things which are common, it's language, yeah, and it's very important to recognize that. But this is not where politics takes place.
No,
politics takes place in the level of the public. And I think that it's a mistake to do what Michael does, to identify. I understand why he doesn't want the term public, because he said the public is necessarily, the kind of bureaucratic state that we exist. I'm against that also, but I don't think that we should, abandon the idea of the public for that. We should fight for the democratization of the public space. And I think that this is precisely what I'm trying to do with my idea of the agonistic public space. So yes, let's say the common, let's say and of course there is also the domain of that would be the private, but the domain of the political is the domain of the public, where there is precisely contestation. And then I don't think I agree with your question about art, that art should be put at the level of the common, but because then it means that you put art completely outside of politics. Well, that is definitely something that I would not agree. But maybe, I don't know, I mean, you could imagine that there is a dimension of art that escapes, maybe. But, I mean, I think I'd like to see what you say about that, about the dimension of art that could be... could we say that part of art belongs to the common and part to the public? I mean...
There's a moment when art becomes visible, and let me try, and that's also an institutional question, which goes back to your idea of the fact that artists are always imagining the world always. Yes, but unless it's visible. And I can come back to your point, where you say you can think anything, you can interpret Proust in any way, and you're completely free to do so. Yes, you are, until the point where that visibility of that becomes political, because somebody says that they don't agree with you. In fact, they don't agree with you to the point they want to shut you up. And it's very, very easy for us to imagine a society in which some interpretations of Proust would not be ideologically acceptable. We know that that has already happened. So therefore, the fact that you have the notion that you say that you can think anything, of course, is a freedom which is perhaps very much in the notion of the common. But and art and the generation of art, the actual artistic act, in the studio, in the moment of creation, perhaps even in the installation, is perhaps something which belongs to the common. But the moment that it becomes visible, in other words, the moment it enters the public sphere, which is generally through the mechanisms of some kind of institution, even a self-institution, some kind of institution, is the moment where it also becomes political. And it seems that you can only understand that relationship if you put between the moment of the artist, I mean, classically working in the studio, producing art, or simply the moment that you understand that Proust is actually a progressive communist text, and then you want to speak that out, and you speak it out in a fascist regime, you're shut up. Now, at that moment, you need the institutions that are not going to oppress you in order for you to speak that up, and they exist. Those cultural institutions exist in relationship to the public. So I think for me, once you add the question of the institution in its broadest sense, so I'm not talking about the museum or anything clumsy like that, but the institution as a framing device for those thoughts that occur in culture, then you can start to talk about the relationship between the common and the political, I think. That would be my...
Michael, don't give up on the common, on your common, because if you, I mean, there is a consistency in your reflection between the common, the idea of absolute democracy, which is something that has not yet been here, and the idea of the self-organization of the multitude. So if you put those three things together, it does give an idea of the common. It's not simply a question of your definition of the public. I mean, that you because it is what's at stake is a very different conception of politics. Let's face it. So not but it's a question of public different no, I think that because I don't agree with the question of the absolute democracy, I don't think they could ever be an absolute democracy, and it's certainly not desirable, because it would mean, in fact, for me, this idea of an absolute, complete realization of democracy would be the destruction of democracy, because it means that there would not be any more agonism, possibility for disagreeing, because we will all have, agree. I find that extremely dangerous, and the idea of the self-organization of the multitude, I don't think that the possibility of self-organization of the multitude. So it's really, don't keep your idea of the common, because it makes sense,